Hey everyone, welcome to week 6. We're moving through the course fairly quickly. We're past a third of the way through the course and almost on our way to the halfway point. So I just want to thank everybody for all of your hard work so far. And I know some of you might be falling behind a little bit. It's normal, but don't let it become don't fall into the pit so deep that it doesn't seem like you're able to climb out. So for this week, we're going to be talking about the evolution of policing, and we're going to talk about the current challenges of policing. So for the main part of this overview, I'm actually going to address the evolution of policing. Some of the stuff was mentioned in the slides. So policing in the United States actually finds its roots in England. When we think about the components or the offices of law enforcement here in the United States, they all come from the English roots, the earlier models. In England, there was the sheriff, which is equivalent or evolved into the sheriff, and then you had the comitatus stabuli, which was the constable. The role of the constable in England is far different than the role of the constable in the United States. Most of our constables, they're an elected official, and you find them at voting polls. But their powers, as compared to England, have dramatically decreased since colonial time to now. And then we have the state examiner. So those three original roles of law enforcement actually made their way over to the United States, to the colonies, and were written into the colonial charters, and then later into the individual state constitutions of the original 13 states. To separate this and to keep this into some type of format, if we were to look at, say, policing, which is a statutory position, meaning that it was created by statute, not written into the Constitution. So policing has all they have all criminal powers, meaning that they can arrest you, they can cite you for speeding, they can the variety of different things, but their powers are based on the criminal laws and under statute. The sheriff, being the supreme law enforcement officer of the colonial period, was written into the Constitution, and the sheriff still to this day maintains both criminal and civil powers. Now, criminal powers I've just explained regarding policing, but the civil powers would be eviction notices, removal or court notices like summonses and subpoenas. The sheriff would handle those. Now, the constable also has civil powers, meaning that they can serve you papers like an eviction notice or something to do with the courts. They do not have criminal powers, so they cannot make you make an arrest. What's interesting, and I've just mentioned this, what's interesting about this is that the sheriff is still considered the supreme law enforcement officer of the county, meaning if the Massachusetts State Police colonel came in and there was a critical incident and the sheriff was there and present, the sheriff could tell the sheriff to take a bus and that he was in charge, and he would legally be right to do that. We notice this in other states. A lot of the southern and western states still have sheriffs that both engage in civil and criminal powers, and the state police is a minor supportive role. So getting back to the earlier models, we have to understand that policing wasn't just there. It grew out of necessity. And when we look at the earlier villages, the villages really, or a watchman system, the villages created this watchman system that people would stand outside the village on higher, like scaffolding or fences, and they would look out for marauders or raiders to the village. The crimes that they were really concerned with weren't really about the people within the community. It was people trying to come into the community and harm them. So that evolved out with, as population grew, that the crime started to occur within the community and not just from marauders outside of the community. Another change in human history was the advent or the emergence of gin. Gin was a cheaply made alcohol and it could be made fairly quickly. And as we know, drunk people tend to have to cause problems. If you've ever been to a house party, it's usually the super drunk people that get us all in trouble. And it wasn't the calm people that was just sipping down their beers. So we understand that intoxication and criminality have a common bond with each other. So with population, the emergence of gin, local cities throughout England and throughout the world really recognize the need for policing. The first formal police force, or informal, we would say now, would be the Bow Street Runners. So the Bow Street Runners were created under Sir Henry Fielding, and Fielding felt that, you know what, we really need a group of people dedicated to maintaining the peace. In other words, if there was a bar fight, they would separate the fight and send people along their way. These Bow Street Runners were identified as wearing a red sash along their arm. In other words, they had street clothes on, not a uniform and simple red sash. One of the problems that emerged out of the Bow Street Runners was the concept of corruption. We all know that when you put a uniform on people, this can go in two different directions, and you can either kind of rise above and serve the community, or you can use the uniform and the badge as in a negative way for your own personal gratitude or whatever, to have your own advantages and not serve the community in the right way. So the Bow Street Runners fell into that pit. And what they would do is they would go in to a shopkeeper and demand extortion. In other words, I'm here, you're going to pay me for extra services. If you don't, then when you get robbed, I won't be here to help you. And the shopkeeper would say, no, I'm not paying you any money. I already pay my taxes, and that's how you get paid. And the Bow Street Runner would leave. He would take the sash off, he would find some criminals, and they would go in and rob and rough the guy up. Then he would leave, he'd put the red sash back on and come back in and say, if you had paid me, this wouldn't have happened to you. And then the shop owner would be forced to pay them, knowing that they would come back and do it again. So time went on. England recognized that the Bow Street Runners were a failed experiment, a great groundbreaker in regards to understanding what civil policing was versus having a military unit in the city, which brings us into the London Metropolitan Police. So Sir Robert Peel basically came up with the concept of, you know what, we need a more formalized police force. We need them to wear uniforms. They need to be recognized by the people or the population of London as being peacekeepers, that they were there for the purposes of serving the community, and they were easily identifiable minus the red sash. Two problems arose from that. One, the first problem was that the uniform. Historically, when a unit or a group of people entered a city in uniform, it meant a coup. That meant that the military was coming in. For centuries, the military was ordered to take their uniforms off before entering into any city. The Roman legions were forced to leave their uniforms on the edge of Rome before walking into Rome as a Roman citizen. They were no longer a member of a legion once they stepped foot into the city of Rome. The same thing happened in England. You were not allowed to walk into England with a uniform on because it was fear. People feared, had a history that people in uniform were coming to take over the government. That was a major issue, and people needed to get over it because Robert Peel was not going to back down on this. The second issue was we still didn't professionalize law enforcement at this point. So corruption still kind of became part of the norm. It should be noted at this point that there are three eras of policing. Typically the fourth one is emerging now. The first era is the political era, meaning that in order to gain a job as a police officer or a deputy sheriff, you needed to know somebody. You had to have some type of connection. So there was a high level of cronyism, favoritism. They just really weren't professionalizing, and they were hiring their friends and their family, and just based on being a good old guy. Well, that ran into problems, as we've already mentioned, with the London Metropolitan Police and the Bow Street Runners. So now we move into the professional model. The professional model required some formalized training, that there weren't any family connections within the department, and that you needed to take an exam to qualify to get into the department, and had to pass through that formalized academy. The issue was that it became so formalized that in New York City Police during the 1970s, an officer graduate from the academy would receive a card, and on that card it would say domestic violence 30 minutes, assault and battery 15 minutes, murder 2 hours. That was the times that was designated that it would take an officer to solve or close out a case. So that meant that officers were being timed on how long they made these calls, so that they weren't idle. Now, this is what we call incident-based policing, instead of like a proactive style of policing. That meant that they were going from incident to incident, they were being dispatched, they were being timed, and then if any time went over on it, then they were being penalized. They would be spoken to by their captain and say, you spent too long on this case. The negative part of that is it became, again, that incident-based policing, which didn't give the officers enough time to address the victims. So victims were pretty much ignored at that point. They came in, made the arrest as fast as possible, got out the door, dropped the person off, wrote up this fast report, and went out to the next incident. The next era of policing was the community-based model, community-based or community policing model. And that's when we recognized that the black leather coat from a police officer was essentially intimidating and did not make the officer approachable. The other part of that is that we started to require officers to think more independently, but in line with a more educated response. That's where criminal justice programs started to grow throughout the country, and that officers started to seek higher degrees. And why that if you're seeking a promotion within the police department, an associate's degree isn't just going to cut it, that you're going to need a bachelor's degree or master's degree. I know that many chiefs of police in Massachusetts are actually, the departments are actually looking for officers that are captains and lieutenants or deputy chiefs that have already earned a PhD. So we're getting the more highly educated officer, and at the same time, we're looking at departments that are engaging the community, business owners and residents. That this community model, that we've recognized that solving crime is not the police job alone. Solving crime takes a village. It takes a community to say, we don't accept this type of behavior, and this is who's doing it, or this is the information I have on this. The snitches get stitches is going out the window because people are getting more and more involved in policing. This has had a significant impact on reducing police corruption and abuse of power and excessive force. So an officer that's engaged with their community is less likely to use excessive force, because they're not just the police officers, they're actually members of the community, and they're trying to protect all members of the community. The fourth era that we've just recently moved into since 2001 is the terrorism era, or the militarized era. So this is coming in clashes with the community-based era, because now we're buying, departments are buying equipment and training personnel in response to terrorist types incidents. So we have that community-based era, but now we've moved back to, like, say, the SWAT model, so that SWAT model doesn't seem to be approachable for the community. But there's a need for both of them, and somehow we'll find a way to get it all to fit together. So with that, I'll move into the American structure. So the American structure has three components to it. There's a federal system, a state system, and a local system. So if I think of, like, say, Andover Police Department, that's a local system. That's part of the local state government, the local municipality. And any officer in the state of Massachusetts that seeking, or an individual seeking to become an officer in the state of Massachusetts, must complete an MPTC academy. And that's the Municipal Police Training Council's academy. Now, that academy, the criteria for that academy and the curriculum for that academy is the same in Boston as it is in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is on the New York border, or from New Hampshire to Rhode Island. It's the same exact academy, same length, and same curriculum. The instructors all have to go through specific training. One of the things that I have been seeking, and I saw through the MPTC, was a level 3 instructors training to make it so that I was able to teach in the academy. So we all have to go through this at some point or another. The other level, the next level up, is the Massachusetts State Police or State Police. In between that, you would have county government. And if we were talking about southern or western states, the sheriff's department would fall under that county government. Here in Massachusetts, the county governments were abolished back in 1998, where the state assumed responsibility for the county governments, specifically the sheriff's department, which is the jail and house of correction. But the sheriff is still listed in the Constitution, and it would require an amendment for the Constitution to eliminate that position. So the sheriff still enjoys that constitutional power. So the state level was typically the state police or an investigative arm, like the Arkansas Bureau of Investigation, which is a state agency. The next level would be the federal agencies, and we are familiar with the FBI, the Secret Service, the ATF, the Treasury Department, all agencies like that. The CIA does not fall under that because that is an foreign intelligence gathering apparatus. It's not designed under the 3 levels of law enforcement. And the last part of this would be the increased technology. That if you review the slides a little bit deeper, you'll notice that the use of the NCIC, III, and CJIS. CJIS stands for the Criminal Justice Information System. It's operated by the Massachusetts Criminal Justice History Board. So if a police officer pulls you over, they access CJIS. And I'll go into the next block on that in a second. But CJIS basically says whether or not you have an open warrant, if your registration is expired, a variety of things that your criminal history will pop up on the officer's onboard CPU and their cruisers. That CJIS system actually is not a standalone, it's more of a stop point. It doesn't allow the officer to input on the national database. And the national database, or CJIS, enters into III, and that's the interstate index. And it allows officers to, it allows the Criminal History Board to enter in new charges. And then III feeds that into what we call NCIC, and that's the National Crime Information Center, or NCIC 2000, which offers a lot of data in its nationally. It's in Canada, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. It's also in Guam. So it's accessed at a huge level. And the problem with it, we go back to the CJIS concept of it. The problem with entering information is that you might enter in wrong information or duplicates, and that's the reason CJIS and the III are in place to block any extra information or wrong information being entered into NCIC 2000. So that's the basics on technology with regards to law enforcement. I hope you enjoy this week, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me.